What happens when Hollywood's toughest guy walks into what should be a routine morning show interview, only to discover the host has a hidden agenda that goes way beyond promoting his latest movie? Well, you're about to find out. And trust me, this confrontation got so heated that security had to get involved. But before we dive into this explosive showdown, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really went down behind the scenes. The morning started like any other at the Good Morning America studios in Times Square. Sylvester Stallone had arrived early, dressed in his signature black leather jacket, looking every bit the action hero, even at 77 years old. His publicist had briefed him on what to expect, a light conversation about his upcoming film, maybe some nostalgia about Rocky and Rambo, the usual promotional circuit stuff. What nobody anticipated was that George Stephanopoulos had spent the previous evening digging through old interviews and controversial statements, preparing what he clearly saw as his moment to play hardball journalist rather than morning show host. As the cameras rolled and the familiar Good Morning America theme music faded, George flashed that practiced television smile, the kind that never quite reaches the eyes. We're here with legendary actor Sylvester Stallone. He began, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he'd perfected during his political days. Sly, thanks for joining us this morning. Stallone settled back in the plush interview chair, that familiar slight slur in his voice as he responded. Thanks for having me, George. Always good to be here. But something in George's demeanor should have been a warning sign. Instead of the usual warm-up questions about family or current projects, he leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting to what he probably thought was serious journalism mode. Before we talk about your new film, I want to address something that's been bothering a lot of our viewers. You've made some pretty strong political statements over the years, and frankly, some people are questioning whether Hollywood stars should be using their platforms to influence political discourse. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Stallone's expression didn't change immediately, but those who knew him well would have recognized the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set just a fraction more firmly. This wasn't what they discussed in the pre-interview. Well, George, Stallone said, his voice still measured, but with an edge creeping in. Last time I checked, this was still America, and Americans have the right to express their opinions. That includes actors, journalists, and even former political operatives turned morning show hosts. The dig about George's political background was subtle, but unmistakable. George's smile faltered for just a moment before he pressed on, clearly determined to pursue whatever angle he'd planned. But don't you think there's a responsibility that comes with fame? When you speak, millions of people listen. Shouldn't you be more careful about the messages you're sending? Stallone shifted in his chair. And now there was no mistaking the irritation in his voice. Careful about what exactly? About speaking my mind, about loving my country? I've been in this business for 50 years, George, and I've never pretended to be anything other than what I am. If that bothers some people, well, that's their problem, not mine. The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. The camera operators exchanged glances, and in the control room, producers were starting to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This was supposed to be a promotional interview, not a political debate. George, however, seemed energized by the conflict. Perhaps he thought he was channeling his old political instincts, or maybe he genuinely believed he was doing important journalism. Either way, he doubled down. I'm just saying that with great power comes great responsibility, and your platform gives you enormous power to influence people's thinking. Did you just quote Spider-Man at me? Stallone asked, and for a moment there was genuine disbelief in his voice. George, I came here to talk about my movie, to maybe share some stories that would entertain your audience. I didn't come here to be lectured by someone who spent years spinning stories for politicians about how I should use my voice. The reference to George's past as a political strategist and White House communications director clearly struck a nerve. George's professional composure slipped noticeably, his voice taking on a sharper edge. I think that's a little unfair, Sly. My background gives me insight into how public messaging works. And I'm just suggesting that maybe, just maybe, you should think before you speak. Think before I speak? Stallone repeated, his voice rising slightly. The famous Stallone temper, usually kept well in check during public appearances, was starting to show. Let me tell you something about thinking before you speak, George. I've been thinking about what I want to say for 7 decades. I've earned the right to speak my mind through hard work, through creating characters that inspired people, through entertaining millions of families. What gives you the right to sit there and tell me I should think before I speak? The studio audience, which had been expecting a light-hearted interview, was now witnessing something entirely different. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed fascinated by the unfolding drama. The producers in the control room were frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let this play out. George, perhaps realizing he'd pushed too far, but unable to back down gracefully, tried a different approach. "Look, I'm not trying to attack you personally. I'm just asking the questions that I think our viewers want answered. There's been criticism of some of your recent statements, and I think people deserve to hear your response." "What criticism?" Stallone demanded. "From who? From Twitter? From bloggers who've never created anything in their lives? From political pundits who change their opinions based on polling data? You want to talk about thinking before speaking, George? Maybe you should have thought about what this interview was supposed to be about before you decided to turn it into some kind of political ambush." The word ambush hung in the air, and suddenly everyone in the studio understood that this had moved far beyond a normal interview tension. This was personal now, and Stallone was not backing down. George's face was flushed now, his carefully maintained television persona cracking under the pressure. It's not an ambush to ask legitimate questions about public statements. That's called journalism. Something you might not understand given your background in, well, punching people on screen. The insult was delivered with George's trademark smile, but it was clearly meant to wound. The suggestion that Stallone was somehow intellectually inferior, just a dumb actor who pretended to fight for a living, was precisely the kind of Hollywood condescension that had always infuriated the Philadelphia-born actor who'd fought his way up from poverty. Stallone's response was immediate and cutting. "Punching people on screen, huh? Well, at least when I punch someone, the audience knows it's fiction. When you were spinning stories in Washington, people thought they were getting the truth. Which one of us was really fooling people, George?" The studio fell silent, except for the low hum of the cameras still rolling. George's mouth opened slightly, as if he was about to respond, but no words came out immediately. In that moment of silence, both men seemed to realize that they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds in television time. That's a lifetime. George's face had gone from flushed to pale, his carefully styled hair looking slightly disheveled despite not having moved. The comment about spinning stories in Washington had hit exactly where Stallone intended it to hit. Right at George's professional credibility and personal pride. When George finally found his voice again, it was different. Gone was any pretense of the friendly morning show host, replaced by something much colder and more calculating. "I think you're being incredibly unfair and frankly disrespectful to our audience. People tune in to Good Morning America because they trust us to ask the hard questions, not to serve up softball interviews that are basically just advertisements for your movies." Stallone leaned back in his chair, but it wasn't a relaxed posture. It was the movement of someone getting ready to spring into action, like a boxer assessing his opponent between rounds. "Hard questions. George, you want to ask hard questions? Here's a hard question for you. When you were working in the White House spinning stories and manipulating the media, did you ever think about the responsibility that came with that platform? Or were you too busy trying to control what people thought to worry about telling them the truth?" The attack was surgical and devastating. George's entire post-political career had been built on reinventing himself as a serious journalist, someone who'd moved beyond the partisan world of politics to pursue objective truth. Having that transformation questioned, especially on live television, was clearly something he hadn't prepared for. "That's completely different," George stammered, his composure continuing to crack. "My role in the White House was to communicate policy positions. What I do now is journalism. I ask tough questions of everyone, regardless of their political affiliation." "Really?" Stallone's voice was dripping with skepticism now. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you invited me here under false pretenses, so you could ambush me with political questions that have nothing to do with why I agreed to appear on your show. Is that your idea of objective journalism? Or is this just your way of trying to prove you're still relevant in a world that's moved on from your political days?" The suggestion that George was clinging to relevance struck deep. In the control room, the executive producer was now standing, gesturing frantically at the cameras while speaking rapidly into his headset. Several of the crew members had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold. This was no longer just an interview gone wrong. This was television history in the making. George's response came through gritted teeth. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone, especially not to someone whose biggest contribution to American culture is a series of movies about hitting people. At least my work in politics actually mattered. The insult to Stallone's life's work was so blatant, so unnecessary, that even some of the crew members visibly winced. George had just dismissed not only Rocky and Rambo, but decades of work that had inspired millions of people around the world. He'd attacked the very foundation of Stallone's identity and career. Stallone's voice dropped to almost a whisper, but somehow it carried more menace than if he'd been shouting. Movies about hitting people? Is that what you think Rocky was about? A movie about hitting people? Rocky was about a guy from Philadelphia who got one shot to prove he belonged, who went the distance when everyone said he couldn't. It was about hope, about dignity, about never giving up even when the world counts you out. Millions of people found inspiration in that story, George. They found courage. What exactly has your career inspired people to do? Lie better? Spin the truth more effectively. George realized he'd made a critical error. But instead of backing down, he doubled down with the desperation of someone who knows he's losing badly. Don't lecture me about inspiration. At least my work was in the real world, dealing with real issues that affect real people's lives. You make fantasy movies for entertainment. Fantasy? Stallone's voice rose again, and now there was genuine anger in his tone. You think the struggles that Rocky went through were fantasy? You think the guys coming back from Vietnam who saw themselves in Rambo were watching fantasy? These characters meant something to people because they represented something real, something true about the human spirit. What was real about the stories you told in Washington, George? What was true about the spin you put on policies that affected millions of lives? The studio audience was completely silent now, some looking back and forth between the two men like they were watching a tennis match, others appearing genuinely uncomfortable with the level of animosity on display. Several audience members had their phones out, undoubtedly recording what they sensed was something extraordinary. George's media training kicked in, and he tried to regain control of the situation by redirecting. Look, we're getting off track here. I'm not trying to attack your movies. I'm trying to have a serious conversation about the responsibility that comes with celebrity, and you're making this personal. I'm making this personal? Stallone's laugh was harsh and completely without humor. George, you started this conversation by questioning my right to have opinions. You continued it by dismissing my work as just punching people on screen. And now you want to lecture me about making things personal? You made this personal the moment you decided to use this interview to grind some political axe, instead of doing what you told my people you were going to do. The mention of what had been promised versus what was being delivered clearly struck a nerve with George, who knew that ambushing guests was a violation of the basic trust that makes television interviews possible. His response was defensive and telling. Sometimes in journalism, you have to follow the story where it leads, even if that makes people uncomfortable. Follow the story where it leads. Stallone repeated incredulously. What story, George? The story of a 77-year-old actor who has the audacity to have opinions about his own country? The story of someone who worked his way up from nothing and thinks he's earned the right to speak his mind? Or is this the story of a former political operative who's trying to prove he's a serious journalist by attacking guests who can't fight back because they're trapped in your studio? The phrase "trapped in your studio" seemed to crystallize something for both men. Stallone looked around at the cameras, the crew, the audience, all watching this confrontation unfold, and his expression hardened even further. George followed his gaze and seemed to realize for the first time how this was all playing out, how he looked to the viewers at home. Nobody's trapped here, George said, but his voice lacked conviction. This is a conversation between two adults about important issues. Nobody's trapped here. A conversation. Stallone stood up from his chair, the movement sudden and dramatic enough that several crew members took an involuntary step back. George, this stopped being a conversation about 20 minutes ago. This became an interrogation. And I've got news for you. I didn't come here to be interrogated by someone who thinks his political background gives him the right to question my patriotism or my right to have opinions. Standing, Stallone looked even more imposing than he had sitting down. Even at 77, he carried himself with the physicality of someone who'd spent decades staying in fighting shape, and his presence seemed to fill the small interview area. George, still seated, suddenly looked very small in comparison. Sit down, Sly, George said, trying to reassert some authority. We're not finished here. The words were barely out of his mouth before Stallone responded, his voice carrying a finality that everyone in the studio could hear. Yeah, George, we are. The declaration that they were finished hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. George, still seated and looking up at the towering figure of Stallone, made what would prove to be his final and most catastrophic mistake of the interview. Instead of accepting the clear signal that this had gone too far, he tried to regain control with a condescending smirk. You know, Sly, for a guy who makes a living pretending to be tough, you're getting awfully sensitive about a few questions. The words hit Stallone like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because they were a deliberate attempt to belittle his entire career and persona. The air in the studio crackled. Stallone's eyes, usually warm and expressive, turned to chips of ice. His voice, when it came, was a low growl that sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. Sensitive? George, I've faced down Russian boxers, Vietnamese commandos, and street gangs. I've been shot, stabbed, and blown up more times than you've had hot dinners. You think a few snide remarks from a glorified political spin doctor are going to make me sensitive? He took a step closer to the desk, his shadow falling over the seated Stephanopoulos. No, George. What you're seeing isn't sensitivity. It's disgust. Disgust at a journalist who abuses his platform, who ambushes his guests, and who thinks that tearing people down makes for good television. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. You want to talk about tough, George? Tough is fighting for every single thing you've ever gotten in life. Tough is inspiring millions of people with stories of hope and resilience. Tough is standing up for what you believe in, even when some smug, self-important talking head tries to belittle you on national television. He straightened up, his gaze sweeping across the stunned studio. And you know what else is tough, George? Knowing when to walk away from a losing fight. With that, Sylvester Stallone turned on his heel and, with a powerful stride, walked directly off the set, leaving a visibly shaken George Stephanopoulos staring at the empty space where the legendary actor had just been. The cameras lingered on George's stunned face for an uncomfortably long moment before the show abruptly cut to a commercial. The silence in the studio was deafening, a testament to the raw power of the confrontation that had just unfolded. The internet, of course, exploded. Clips of the interview went viral within minutes, sparking a global debate about journalistic ethics, celebrity responsibility, and the true meaning of toughness. Was Stallone right to walk out? Was George Stephanopoulos out of line? One thing is for sure, Good Morning America will never be the same. And the world just got a glimpse of a side of Sylvester Stallone we rarely see. A man of unwavering integrity, pushed to his absolute limit. What do you think about this shocking confrontation? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more exclusive content like this. If you were as shocked as we were by this interview, hit that like button and share this video with your friends. What are your thoughts on Sylvester Stallone's reaction and George's questions? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into celebrity drama and untold stories.